The rain had not stopped for 11 minutes, and in that time, Daniel Reyes had not moved from the dock. His daughter's small hand wrapped around two of his fingers, both of them soaked through, while 40 feet above them, Vanessa Cole stood at the rail of her $300 million yacht and told him, in front of 6 crew members and a dozen stunned guests, that he was finished, not suspended, not written up. Finished. Because he had made the mistake of bringing his 8-year-old daughter aboard during a medical emergency. When the babysitter's car had broken down on the highway and his ex-wife wasn't answering her phone, and the alternative was leaving a child alone in a locked car in a marina parking lot at 11 o'clock at night. He did not argue with Vanessa Cole. He looked up at her, water running down his collar, his daughter shivering against his leg, and he simply nodded once, the way a man nods when he has already decided something and no longer needs anyone else's permission to act on it. If you've ever done everything right and still been made into the villain of someone else's story, stay with this one until the end, because what happened over the next 10 days would not just cost Vanessa Cole her yacht. It would cost her every harbor in the country. 4 weeks before that night on the dock, Daniel Reyes had walked into the marina office wearing a plain gray jacket with no name tag, no company logo, nothing that suggested he was anything other than what his resume said he was. 52 years old, 22 years in the Navy, 11 of those as a commander. Divorced. 1 daughter, Mia, age 8. Seeking part-time deckhand work, flexible hours, evenings and weekends only. The marina's hiring manager had barely glanced at the resume. He needed bodies for the summer season, men who could coil rope and clean decks and stay quiet around wealthy clients, and a retired naval officer looking for part-time work raised no red flags worth investigating. He shook Daniel's hand, told him to report to slip 44 the following Monday, and that was that. What the hiring manager did not know, and what Daniel did not volunteer, was that the navigation and berthing control system running underneath every dock in that harbor, the system that told 200 vessels where they could and could not tie up when the tide gates opened, which berths were rated for which tonnage, had been designed 16 years earlier by a naval engineering contractor called Meridian Systems, and Daniel Reyes had been the lead architect on that contract. He still held the maintenance and licensing agreement through a small consulting firm he'd quietly kept running in his own name, the kind of unglamorous infrastructure work nobody thought about until it stopped working. He had not taken the deckhand job because he needed the money desperately. He had taken it because, after the divorce, sitting alone in an office, reviewing tide charts had started to feel like a kind of slow suffocation, and he wanted work that let him be outside, on the water, with his hands doing something simple while his mind rested. He wanted, more than anything, a schedule flexible enough that he could still pick Mia up from school on the days that were his. The yacht he was assigned to was called Aurelia, Vanessa Cole's yacht. Vanessa had inherited controlling interest in Cole Maritime Holdings 4 years earlier, when her father suffered a stroke that left him unable to run the company he'd spent 40 years building. She was 38, sharp in the way people are, sharp when they've spent their whole life being told they were destined for something, and she ran the company the way she ran her personal life. Fast, expensive, and allergic to being told no. The first time Daniel met her, she did not learn his name. She referred to him only as the new one. For the first 3 weeks, speaking about him in the third person, even when he was standing directly in front of her, coiling a line or wiping down brass fittings. It was not unkind, exactly. It was simply the practiced obliviousness of someone who had never had to remember the names of people who served her. Daniel did not mind. He had commanded submarines with 90 men aboard whose names he'd known by heart within a week, and there was a kind of quiet amusement in being underestimated by someone who couldn't be bothered to learn a name. He did his work. He did it better than anyone else on the crew, though he never said so. And he never needed to. The other deckhands noticed. The captain noticed. Vanessa Cole did not. He noticed things too. That was the part of him that had never really left the Navy. The part that scanned a room or a harbor or a hull and cataloged what was wrong before he'd even decided to look for it. 3 weeks into the job, doing a routine check of the berth's mooring cleats, he noticed something in the yacht's dock paperwork that didn't sit right. Aurelia's berthing contract listed a vessel displacement and beam that didn't match what he could see with his own eyes. standing on the dock and looking at the hull in front of him. The numbers on paper described a smaller boat, a boat that would have qualified for a lower berthing tier, cheaper docking fees, and looser inspection requirements. He said nothing about it at first. He'd learned a long time ago that a discrepancy was not the same as a crime, and that the fastest way to make an enemy of a system was to accuse it of wrongdoing before you understood why the wrongdoing existed. So he watched. He asked questions that sounded like small talk. He learned, over several quiet conversations with the marina's dockmaster, an old man named Frank Delgado, who'd worked the harbor for 30 years and trusted almost no one, that Aurelia's berthing paperwork had been quietly amended 18 months earlier, shortly after Vanessa took over the company. Classifying the yacht under a shell entity that paid a fraction of the docking fee a vessel of its actual size should have paid. Frank had noticed it too. Frank had said something about it to the marina's operations director, a man named Grant Whitfield, and Frank had been told in no uncertain terms to let it go. Grant Whitfield was the kind of man who had built a career out of never being the one holding the paperwork when something went wrong. He was Cole Maritime's on-site operations director for the Marina Division, a position that gave him authority over docking assignments, inspection schedules, and vendor contracts, and he had used that authority for years to smooth the edges off whatever Vanessa Cole's yacht happened to need. Extra fuel deliveries that skipped the manifest log, inspection windows that always seemed to open right before Aurelia needed them and close right after, a berthing fee structure that nobody above him seemed interested in auditing, because auditing it would have meant admitting that the CEO's personal yacht had been illegally underpaying for dockage for the better part of 2 years. Daniel did not go to Grant Whitfield with what he'd found. He'd been in enough organizations to know that men like Whitfield did not fix problems. They buried them, and burying them usually meant finding someone convenient to bury along with them. Instead, he kept a private file. He photographed the posted berth specifications. He cross-referenced them against the yacht's registered tonnage, which was public record if you knew where to look, and he kept dated notes the way he'd been trained to keep a ship's log. Plainly, factually, without embellishment. He did this not because he had a plan yet, but because it was simply what he did. He documented things. It was a discipline older than this job, older than the divorce, older than almost everything else in his life except Mia. Mia was, in most ways, the center around which the rest of his life quietly organized itself. He picked her up from school on Tuesdays and Thursdays and every other weekend per the custody agreement, and on those evenings he cooked simple dinners in his small rented house 2 miles from the marina. A house that was tidy in the particular way that homes become tidy, when a person has decided that order is one of the few things still fully under his control. Mia liked to sit at the kitchen counter and do her homework while he cooked, and she liked to ask him questions about the Navy, about submarines, about how deep the ocean really went, and he answered every one of them carefully, the way he answered everything, like the question deserved to be taken seriously. She was, in the plainest sense, the reason he still went to work every day, and she was the reason that when his ex-wife called on a Friday night in a slight panic, saying the babysitter's car had died on the interstate, and she herself was stuck at a work event 2 hours away, he did not hesitate. He was scheduled to work that night. Aurelia was hosting a private event, investors and board members a floating fundraiser for some initiative Vanessa wanted associated with her name. He called the marina office to explain the situation, to ask if there was any flexibility, and was told by a junior scheduler that no, the crew roster was fixed, and if he didn't show up, he'd be marked as a no-call no-show, which under his contract was grounds for termination. He waited for exactly as long as it took to look at his daughter, who was already in her pajamas half asleep on the couch. With nowhere else to go, he brought her with him. He set her up in the crew's small break room below decks, gave her a blanket, her tablet, a granola bar, and told her to stay put, and that he'd check on her every 20 minutes, which he did, like clockwork, slipping away from his duties for 90 seconds at a time to open the door and confirm she was safe. It was not against any written safety regulation. He had checked. There was no rule prohibiting a crew member's dependent from being aboard in a non-operational space during an emergency, and he had made sure of that before he ever brought her up the gangway. What he had not accounted for was that 40 minutes into the event, one of the investors, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and sharper instincts, wandered below decks looking for a restroom and found an 8-year-old girl sitting alone in a crew break room. She did not react with alarm. She reacted with mild curiosity, and mentioned it almost as an aside to Vanessa Cole 20 minutes later, over champagne, as an interesting little detail about the crew. Vanessa Cole did not take it as an interesting little detail. She took it as an embarrassment, a liability. A story that could, in the wrong retelling, make its way into a gossip column as CEO's yacht doubles as unlicensed daycare. And Vanessa Cole had spent 4 years building a public image, specifically designed to prove she was not her father's soft-hearted daughter, but a serious executive who ran a serious company. And the idea that a deckhand had smuggled a child aboard during her event, without asking, without permission, struck her as exactly the kind of undisciplined behavior that made her look like she couldn't control her own staff. She did not ask Daniel for an explanation. She found him on the aft deck, coiling a line, and she told him in a voice pitched to carry that he was done, that he had exhibited a stunning lack of judgment, that whatever emergency he thought justified endangering a child by bringing her onto a moving vessel among strangers was not her problem, and that he could collect his final pay from the office and not bother coming back. Daniel had listened to the entire thing without interrupting. Then he had gone below decks, gathered his daughter who had heard raised voices, and gone very quiet and very still in the way children do when they sense that something has gone wrong because of them, and he had carried her, not walked, but carried her, off the yacht and down onto the dock where they stood together in the rain that had just begun to fall. He did not defend himself to Vanessa Cole. He did not shout up at her from the dock, though several of the guests clearly expected him to. He simply looked up once, made sure she saw that he had heard her, and then knelt down in the rain to zip his daughter's jacket higher against her neck. "Are we in trouble?" Mia asked him, her voice small. "No," he said. "You didn't do anything wrong, did you?" He considered the question with the same seriousness. He considered everything she asked him. "No," he said, "but sometimes doing the right thing still costs you something." "That doesn't mean it was the wrong thing to do," she nodded. "The way children nod when they don't fully understand something but trust the person telling them." Behind them, up on the deck, Vanessa Cole was already turning back to her guests, already smoothing the moment over with a practiced laugh and a comment about staffing issues, already ordering the captain to prepare for departure so the evening could continue as though nothing had happened. What she did not know, what nobody on that yacht knew, was that the man she had just publicly humiliated on his own dock owned the licensing contract for the very navigation and berthing control system that would, in exactly 11 minutes, refuse to let her leave the harbor. Daniel walked with Mia to his truck, got her settled in the back seat with the heat running, and then, before starting the engine, he took out his phone and made a single call. He called Frank Delgado. "Frank," he said, "I need you to pull the active birthing manifest for slip 16. Aurelia. Tell me what tier she's currently registered under." Frank, who had worked with Daniel long enough by then to recognize the tone in his voice, the flat, unhurried certainty of a man who already knew the answer and was only confirming it, read him the listing over the phone. Tier 2. Vessel under 120 feet. Registered to a holding entity called Blue Water Leasing LLC. "She's 161 feet, Frank," Daniel said. "I measured the hull myself 3 weeks ago." There was a pause on the line. "What are you going to do?" Frank asked, though it didn't sound like a question so much as an acknowledgement that something was already in motion. "My job," Daniel said. "The one I was actually hired to do before I put a deckhand's uniform on." He did not raise his voice. He did not sound angry. He sounded, if anything, like a man finally getting around to a piece of paperwork he'd been meaning to finish. What Vanessa Cole and Grant Whitfield did not know, because neither of them had ever bothered to read the fine print on the marina's operating agreements, was that the harbor's entire navigation and berthing control system, the digital infrastructure that managed lock timing, channel clearance, tide gate sequencing, and berth authorization for every vessel in that port, was licensed to the Harbor Authority through a company called Reyes Maritime Systems, Daniel's company. He had built the system 16 years earlier as a Navy contractor, then acquired the exclusive maintenance and operating license when the original defense contract wound down because nobody else in the private sector wanted to take on the unglamorous, unsexy work of maintaining harbor infrastructure software for the next 2 decades. The Harbor Authority paid him a modest annual retainer to keep the system running. In exchange, the contract gave him direct authority over the system's permissions architecture, including the ability to flag, restrict, or revoke berth authorizations for any vessel found to be operating outside its registered parameters. It was, in the driest possible legal language, exactly the kind of authority nobody thinks to ask about until the day someone actually uses it. Daniel drove Mia home first. He did not want her anywhere near what was about to happen, and there was, in any case, no need to rush. He tucked her into bed, read 2 pages of the book they'd been working through together, and only once she was asleep did he go into the small office at the back of the house, the room with the single desk, the old filing cabinet, and the humming server tower that ran his consulting business, and log into the Harbor Authority's permissions dashboard. He pulled up Aurelia's file, confirmed the hull measurements against the harbor's own laser dock scanner, records which he had every legal right to access, cross-referenced the vessel's actual displacement against its registered tier, documented the discrepancy the way he documented everything plainly, factually, with timestamps. Then, he flagged the berth for non-compliance and locked the outbound channel authorization for slip 16. It took him 11 minutes. He did not do it out of anger. He wanted to be clear with himself about that. Sitting alone in his quiet office at nearly midnight, the house, silent, except for the hum of the server. He was not doing this because Vanessa Cole had humiliated him on the dock in front of her guests. He would have found the same discrepancy, flagged the same violation, made the same call, whether or not she had ever raised her voice at him at all. The berthing fraud existed before that night, and it would have needed correcting regardless of whether he still had a deckhand job in the morning. That was simply how he thought about the work. The work did not care about his feelings, and he had long ago decided that he would not let his feelings interfere with the work either. But he would be lying if he pretended there wasn't a certain stillness in him, a settledness, knowing that the truth and the timing had, for once, lined up so neatly. Aurelia's crew discovered the problem at 10 past midnight. The captain radioed the harbor control tower for outbound clearance and was told flatly that slip 16's channel authorization had been revoked pending a compliance review. The captain, a longtime employee named Harlan Voss who had worked for Cole Maritime for nearly 2 decades, assumed it was a system error. He radioed again. He got the same answer. He called the Harbor Authority's after-hours line and was informed by a bored night operator that the flag had been placed by the licensed systems administrator of record and that any dispute would need to go through the Harbor Authority's compliance office in the morning. Vanessa Cole, several drinks into her recovered evening, did not take this news calmly. She ordered Voss to simply leave anyway, to treat the digital lock as a formality that could be overridden manually, the way you'd override a stuck garage door. Voss explained with the particular patience of a man who has had to explain unpleasant truths to wealthy employers before, that the tide gate at the harbor mouth was automated and slaved to the same control system, and that attempting to force it open without authorization risked grounding the vessel, or worse, damaging the gate mechanism itself, which would be a federal maritime infrastructure violation with consequences considerably worse than a delayed dinner party. Vanessa did not enjoy being told no twice in one night by 2 different men she considered beneath her. She called Grant Whitfield. Whitfield, roused from sleep, arrived at the marina office within the hour, still buttoning his shirt, already rehearsing the smooth, reassuring tone he used whenever a problem threatened to become visible to people above his pay grade. He pulled up the berthing system himself, saw the flag, saw the name attached to the administrative action, and felt something cold settle into his stomach that he did his best not to show on his face. Reyes. D. Reyes. Systems Administrator of Record, Reyes Maritime Systems, LLC. He had seen that name before. 18 months ago, in fact, buried in a stack of contract renewal documents he'd been asked to review and had signed off on without reading closely, because reading it closely would have meant understanding that the man with ultimate authority over every berth in this harbor was not some faceless municipal bureaucrat in a downtown office, identifiable individual who held a standing legal right to audit exactly the kind of fee reclassification scheme Whitfield had quietly engineered for Aurelia 2 years earlier. He had not made the connection until this exact moment, standing in the marina office at midnight, staring at a name on a screen. "Get him on the phone," Vanessa said when Whitfield explained in careful hedging language that the flag had been placed by the harbor's licensed systems administrator, and that overriding it wasn't simply a matter of asking nicely. "That might be complicated," Whitfield said. "Why?" Whitfield did not answer immediately. Vanessa studied his face, the way she studied balance sheets, looking for the number that didn't add up, and something in his hesitation told her that whatever was complicated about this had very little to do with harbor bureaucracy, and a great deal to do with something Whitfield himself did not want examined. "Grant," she said. "Why?" "Because," Whitfield said slowly, "the systems administrator on record for the harbor's berthing authorization is a man named Daniel Reyes." Vanessa's expression did not change for a long moment. "That's the deckhand," she said. "That's the deckhand," Whitfield confirmed. The silence that followed was not a comfortable one. Vanessa Cole had built her professional identity around the idea that she saw everything, that she understood every layer of the empire she'd inherited, that her father's stroke had not left the company rudderless because she was more than capable of steering it herself. Standing in a marina office at 1 a.m, discovering that a man she'd fired 6 hours earlier for supposedly poor judgment held direct legal authority over whether her yacht could ever leave its slip again, was not a discovery that fit comfortably into that identity. She did not call Daniel that night. Some instinct, buried underneath the anger, told her that calling him at 1 a.m. to demand he reverse a decision he had made with what was clearly deliberate, sober precision would not go the way she wanted it to. Instead, she told Whitfield to fix it in the morning, through whatever channels existed for fixing this kind of thing, and she went back to Aurelia to spend an unplanned and increasingly uncomfortable night moored in a slip she was legally forbidden to leave. The next morning, Whitfield tried the channels. He called the Harbor Authority's compliance office and was told, politely but firmly, that any dispute regarding a systems administrator's non-compliance flag needed to be submitted in writing, reviewed by a compliance board, and that the board's next scheduled session was 4 days out. He tried calling Daniel directly, using the contact number listed in the contract documents, and reached a voicemail that simply stated a name and asked the caller to leave a message. He left 3 messages over the course of the morning, each one slightly more anxious in tone than the last, though he was careful never to let that anxiety slip into anything that could later be quoted as an admission of wrongdoing. Daniel did not call back. This was not spite. It was procedure. He had, as the license administrator, already documented the violation and submitted it to the Harbor Authority's formal compliance process, the same process available to any vessel operator in the port, and he saw no reason to conduct informal negotiations outside that process on behalf of a company that had quietly falsified its own vessel's registration to avoid paying its fair share of docking fees. He went to work that morning as though nothing unusual had happened, except that he no longer had a deckhand job to go to. Instead, he drove Mia to school, came home, and spent the morning in his small office finishing the formal compliance report he intended to submit to the full Harbor Authority Board, a document that laid out, with the same flat, unembellished clarity he brought to everything, the timeline of Aurelia's misregistration, the financial discrepancy it had created over 18 months of underpaid docking fees, and the safety implications of a vessel operating outside its rated berth classification for that length of time. It was, by the time he finished it, 11 pages long. He read it through 3 times before submitting it, not because he doubted its accuracy, but because he understood, in the way a man who had once commanded a submarine, understood that a document like this did not get a second chance to be right the first time it was read by people with the power to act on it. The Compliance Board convened 2 days later, 4 days ahead of its originally scheduled session, because the reporter for the regional maritime trade paper had gotten wind of a story about a yacht stranded in its own harbor and started making calls. And suddenly, the board's chair found it prudent to move quickly, rather than let a 4-day delay turn into a news cycle. Daniel attended. So did Whitfield, representing Cole Maritime Holdings. So, unexpectedly, did Vanessa Cole herself, who had decided overnight that sending a subordinate to handle this had clearly failed, and that the situation required her personal, forceful intervention. She arrived at the compliance hearing, dressed the way she dressed, for investor meetings, sharp and composed, prepared to explain that this entire situation was the result of a disgruntled former employee abusing a minor administrative role to enact personal revenge for a termination that had, in her account, been entirely justified. She had not, however, been prepared for what the board's independent auditor, a woman named Councilwoman Priya Anand, who chaired the port's Regulatory Oversight Committee, had spent the previous 2 days doing with Daniel's 11-page report. Anand had cross-checked every claim in the document against the harbor's own historical berthing records, insurance filings, and fee schedules, and had found that not only was Daniel's account accurate, it actually understated the scale of the problem. Aurelia was not the only Cole Maritime vessel registered under a misclassified tier. 2 smaller company vessels, used for corporate transport between coastal offices, had been registered under a similar shell arrangement, saving the company an estimated total of just under $400,000 in docking and inspection fees over 3 years. Anand laid this out at the hearing in the same flat procedural language Daniel had used in his own report, reading figures aloud from a printed summary while Vanessa Cole sat very still in her chair, her composure intact on the surface, though something in her eyes had begun, almost imperceptibly, to shift. "Miss Cole," Anand said, "were you aware that Aurelia's berthing registration did not match its actual hull specifications?" "I was not involved in the day-to-day administration of docking contracts," Vanessa said. "That falls under operations. And Mr. Whitfield handles operations, yes." Anand turned to Whitfield, who had begun, almost imperceptibly, to sweat. "Mr. Whitfield, can you explain why Blue Water Leasing LLC, the entity listed on Aurelia's berthing contract, shares a registered agent address with a shell company you personally set up 4 years ago?" The room went quiet, in the particular way. Rooms go quiet when everyone in it understands simultaneously that something has just changed. Whitfield's explanation, when it came, was the kind of explanation that sounds plausible, for exactly as long as it takes to say out loud and falls apart the moment anyone thinks about it for more than 5 seconds. He talked about administrative efficiencies, about consolidating vendor relationships, about a misunderstanding regarding vessel classification that he claimed, been in the process of correcting when this whole situation had unfortunately escalated. Daniel did not interrupt him. He sat, hands folded on the table in front of him, and let Whitfield's explanation run its course, the way you let a man finish digging a hole before you hand him the shovel. He'll need to climb back out, except that in this case there was no shovel, and Whitfield was going to be standing at the bottom of that hole for a while. When it was Daniel's turn to speak, he did not raise his voice, did not gesture, did not perform outrage for the benefit of the room. "I was hired as a deckhand," he said. "That job had nothing to do with the harbor's berthing system. I found this discrepancy doing my actual job, which is maintaining that system under a separate license I've held for 16 years. I documented it the same way I document any other non-compliant vessel in this harbor, because the alternative is a berthing system nobody can trust, which eventually means a harbor nobody can trust. This isn't personal. I'd have flagged this if I'd never met Miss Cole in my life." He paused, and then added in the same even tone, "The fact that she fired me the same night I found it is a coincidence of timing. It doesn't change what the numbers say." Vanessa Cole looked at him for a long moment. Something in his answer, the sheer absence of any attempt to make the moment about her, about the humiliation on the dock, about anything other than the plain facts of the case, seemed to land on her harder than an accusation would have. She had spent 4 years surrounded by people who told her what she wanted to hear, who softened bad news, who managed her feelings before they managed the facts. She was not used to being in a room with a man who simply did not care whether she liked what he was saying, because he had not said it for her benefit in the first place. The board's ruling came down within the hour. Aurelia's berthing contract was voided for material misrepresentation. Cole Maritime Holdings was assessed retroactive fees and penalties totaling just over $600,000 across all 3 misregistered vessels. Aurelia herself was formally impounded pending payment and re-registration, meaning she would not leave that harbor or any harbor in the Regional Maritime Compact until the account was settled in full. Grant Whitfield was suspended from his position that afternoon, pending a separate internal investigation into whether the shell company arrangement constituted criminal fraud rather than simple administrative misconduct. He would be formally terminated 3 weeks later and would eventually face a civil suit from Cole Maritime Holdings itself once its newly cautious legal department decided that distancing the company from his actions was more valuable than protecting him. Vanessa Cole did not fire him personally. She barely spoke to him again after the hearing. There is a particular kind of silence powerful people use when they've decided someone no longer matters enough to be angry at, and Whitfield received the full weight of it. What happened over the following 10 days mattered more to the wider story than any single hearing, though. Because the Regional Maritime Trade paper did run its story, and because the story was at its core simply true and well documented, it spread. Other harbor authorities across the country, reading about a berthing fraud scheme that had gone undetected for years because nobody had bothered to cross-check hull registrations against actual vessel measurements, began quietly auditing their own systems. 3 other marinas discovered similar smaller-scale misclassification schemes within the month. A National Maritime Safety Board opened an inquiry into berthing verification standards generally, citing the Aurelia case as the example that had prompted the review. Every harbor that adopted new verification protocols in the following year did so, in some fashion, because of an 11-minute administrative action taken by a man sitting alone in a small home office at midnight, motivated by nothing more complicated than the belief that a system either worked correctly for everyone or it did not really work at all. Vanessa Cole came to see Daniel 8 days after the hearing. She did not call ahead. She drove herself, without a driver, to the small rented house 2 miles from the marina, and she stood on his porch in the early evening light, looking considerably less composed than she had at the hearing, and considerably less composed than she had looked on the deck of her own yacht the night she'd fired him. Mia answered the door first, because Mia had taken to answering the door whenever anyone knocked, and looked up at Vanessa with the plain, unfiltered curiosity of an 8-year-old encountering an adult she vaguely recognized but couldn't place. "Is your dad home?" Vanessa asked. Daniel appeared behind his daughter a moment later, wiping his hands on a dish towel, and did not look surprised to see her. He had, in fact, half expected this visit at some point in the last week, though he could not have said exactly why. He told Mia to go finish her homework at the kitchen table and stepped out onto the small porch himself, closing the door partway behind him. "I'm not here to ask you to reverse anything," Vanessa said, before he could ask why she'd come. "The board's ruling stands. I've already told our legal team to settle in full and stop fighting it." Daniel said nothing. He waited. "I want to offer you something," she said. "A position. Head of Maritime Compliance, reporting directly to the board, independent of operations. You'd have full authority to audit every contract, every berth, every vessel we operate, with no one above you except the board itself." "Why?" Daniel asked. Not hostile, genuinely curious. "Because," Vanessa said, and here her composure slipped slightly in a way that seemed almost involuntary. "Because I've spent 4 years surrounded by people whose entire job is telling me things are fine. Whitfield's job was to make problems disappear before they reached me, and I let him do it because it was easier than asking hard questions. You're the first person in years who told me something true without caring whether I liked hearing it." Daniel considered this for a long moment, the way he considered most things, without rushing toward an answer simply because one was expected. "I'll take the position," he said finally, "on 2 conditions. Name them." "First, the role stays independent. Not just on paper. I don't report through operations. I don't report through Whitfield's old chain ever. I report to the board directly, and I have the authority to act first and explain after. The same way I did with Aurelia." "Agreed," Vanessa said. "And the second, I work part-time. Evenings and one weekend day, same as I told your hiring manager when I first walked into that office. My daughter comes first. That's not a negotiating position. That's just how it's going to be. Vanessa looked past him through the partly open door at Mia sitting at the kitchen table with her homework spread in front of her, tongue poking slightly from the corner of her mouth in concentration. Agreed, she said again, quieter this time. She did not leave immediately. She stood on the porch a moment longer, looking at the small, tidy house, the modest yard, the ordinary, unremarkable life of a man who had, without ever raising his voice, without a single dramatic gesture, dismantled a fraud that had operated safely under her nose for 2 years, simply by doing his job correctly and refusing to be talked out of it. For what it's worth, she said, I was wrong. About that night on the dock. I know, Daniel said. He did not say it unkindly. He said it the way he said most things, as a simple statement of fact, offered without any particular need for her to feel better or worse about hearing it. 3 months later, Cole Maritime Holdings had a new compliance division run out of a small office at the marina that Daniel visited 2 evenings a week and every other Saturday morning. Every vessel the company operated had been remeasured, re-registered, and brought into full compliance, a process that had cost the company a good deal of money and an uncomfortable amount of public scrutiny, but which had also, according to the trade press that had once broken the scandal, made Cole Maritime the single most transparently operated fleet in the regional compact. Grant Whitfield's old office sat empty for a while before it was converted into a records archive. Vanessa Cole came by the compliance office more often than her schedule strictly required, ostensibly to review reports, though the reports rarely took as long to review as her visits lasted. She and Daniel had developed, over those months, an easy, unhurried rapport built less on conversation than on a shared understanding of how things ought to work, an understanding neither of them felt any particular need to dress up in warmer language than it deserved. On a Saturday afternoon in early autumn, Daniel stood on the marina dock with Mia, who was now 9, teaching her how to tie a proper bowline knot, guiding her small hands through the loop and the tuck, with the same patient seriousness he brought to everything. Vanessa Cole walked down the dock toward them, 2 coffees in hand, and held one out to Daniel without a word. He took it. How's the knot coming? Vanessa asked. Mia held up a slightly lopsided loop of rope with obvious pride. It's a little crooked, she said, but Dad says a knot that holds crooked is still better than a knot that looks perfect and doesn't hold at all. Vanessa looked at Daniel over the rim of her coffee cup, something like a smile forming at the corner of her mouth. Your dad says a lot of things like that, she said.
Yeah,
Mia said, matter of fact, already moving on to try the knot again. He's usually right. Daniel said nothing. He watched his daughter's hands work the rope, steady now, patient, learning the same quiet discipline he'd spent a lifetime learning himself. And beside him, Vanessa Cole stood in comfortable silence, no longer a woman who needed someone to tell her things were fine, but one who had finally learned to recognize, on her own, what actually was.